Nobody wanted the old Bowers silo. Not the farmers, not the county, not the scrap man. It stood empty for 30 years behind a fallen fence, corrugated steel gone the color of dull nickel, the dome roof still tight, the door rusted shut. Then Margaret Hale bought it at the tax sale for $1,100, and the auctioneer had to call the lot 3 times before she raised her hand. Dale Harper laughed so loud the feed store heard him, and he told her she'd bought herself a tin can with a door on it. Margaret just smiled and said they'd see about that, because what she read in that steel was something nobody else bothered to look for. The Bowers place sat 2 miles past the county line, where the gravel road thinned to ruts and the prairie opened flat enough to see weather coming from 3 directions. The silo rose at the back of the property, 30 feet of corrugated galvanized steel capped with a domed roof. It had outlasted the barn it once served by a full decade. Now it stood alone in a field that had forgotten how to be a field. The Bowers family quit farming in the early 1990s and moved to Wichita, and the land went to seed behind them. Taxes went unpaid, the fence fell, and the weeds climbed the steel until the whole thing looked like a rusted nail hammered into the prairie. The county finally listed it for back taxes. The auctioneer almost skipped the lot because nobody wanted the trouble of hauling it off. Margaret drove out the morning after the sale with a thermos of coffee and a tape measure. She walked the silo twice, once at a distance and once with her palm flat against the steel. She was feeling the corrugations and the temperature of the metal in the cold. She didn't take notes on that first walk because she'd come to listen, and the building would speak in its own time. She'd learned to read a building from her grandfather Samuel, who could look at a barn frame and tell you which joint would fail first, and which one had another 50 years in it. Samuel taught her that a structure tells you what it's good for, if you bother to listen. Most people never bother. He'd say it plain, with his hand on the wood, and then he'd show you what he meant with a plank turned to the light. She'd carried that into everything she'd ever built, and she carried it out to the Bowers place that morning. Nathan Hale pulled in an hour later with his truck and a ladder. He was her cousin, a quiet man who ran his own fence crew and never asked questions he didn't need the answer to. He looked up at the dome, then back at Margaret, and she told him she wanted to turn it into a house. Nathan didn't laugh. He set the ladder against the steel and climbed to the eaves to check the roof bolts. He came back down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said the dome was sound and the bolts were tight. Margaret nodded, because that was enough for both of them. They started a list of what they'd need on the tailgate of his truck. The prairie wind bent the weeds around the silo while they worked, and the steel gave back a low hum neither of them mentioned. The feed store heard about the sale before lunch, and Dale Harper told every man who'd listen that Margaret Hale had bought a grain bin to live in. The story got funnier every time he told it. He called it a tin can, a satellite dish, a giant coffee mug with a door. The men laughed because Dale was funny, and because living in a silo sounded like a joke that told itself. Nobody asked what Margaret saw in it, because nobody thought there was anything to see. The scrap man had already been out twice and left without making an offer. The reasoning went that if a man who bought metal for a living didn't want it, there wasn't much there to want. Margaret heard his name at the feed store later that week and just kept drinking her coffee, because she'd been underestimated before, and she knew how that story ended. The first week was all inspection, because Margaret wanted to know what the silo could carry before she asked it to carry anything new. Samuel had drilled one thing into her harder than the rest, which was that you never load a structure you haven't listened to first. She and Nathan spent 3 days measuring the steel, testing the bolts, and mapping every patch of rust on a sheet of plywood propped against the wall. The corrugated walls were thickest at the bottom, where the bin had held the full weight of the grain for 30 years, and thinner toward the top. She explained it to Nathan the way Samuel would have, with her hand on the metal and her voice low. The cylinder had been built to hold tons of grain, pressing outward in every direction at once. so the walls already knew how to carry a heavy load evenly around the circle. She tapped the steel with a wrench and listened. A tight ring meant the metal was sound underneath the rust, and a dull thud meant trouble. Most of the bin rang true, and the dull spots were small enough to cut out and patch with fresh sheet steel. Nathan marked each dull spot with chalk, and by the end of the third day the plywood map looked like a field with only a few bad acres. The dome roof shed rain and snow the way it was designed to, and the continuous steel skin had no flat wall anywhere for the wind to catch. Margaret traced the seam where two panels overlapped and told Nathan that a box-framed house fails because the wind finds a flat surface and pushes until something peels open. This shape didn't give the wind anything to push against. She meant to keep it that way through every cut they made. Her plan came out in pieces over those 3 days, and it was less a dream than a set of instructions the steel had already written. She'd frame a floor inside the cylinder with dimensional lumber, insulate the walls with closed-cell foam against the steel and blown-in fill behind that, and pour a concrete floor to hold heat. She'd cut a door and windows by reinforcing the edges of every opening so the steel never lost its strength where it mattered. Nathan asked about the foundation, and Margaret pointed to the concrete ring the silo already sat on. They'd pour a fresh footing around it and anchor the whole shell down, she said, so it couldn't lift even in a wind that would roll a barn. He wrote it all down in a notebook he kept in his truck. He didn't tell her it couldn't be done, because he'd watched her build enough things to know she'd worked out that part. She told him the bin had done the hard part decades ago, when it held grain through 30 winters, and their job was just to see what was there and put it to use. The county building inspector came out the following Tuesday, a man named Pratt with a clipboard and a strong opinion about what a house was supposed to look like. He walked around the silo twice and said he'd need engineered drawings before he could sign off on a residence built inside a grain bin. She'd expected that. She'd already sent for a structural engineer out of the regional college who'd worked on bin conversions before. Pratt shook his head and said he'd believe it when he saw the stamps. Margaret thanked him, filed the paperwork he asked for, and went back to work. She'd learned years ago that you don't talk a man out of an opinion he brought with him. You build the wall, and the wall does the talking. Dale Harper kept the joke alive at the feed store through the whole first month. He'd invented a whole life for Margaret inside the tin can by then, complete with a mailbox bolted to the dome and a welcome mat welded to the door. The men roared every time, and a few of the older ones started calling the place the Bowers Can when they drove past it on the county road. Margaret heard about the nickname and didn't change her expression. She'd learned that the only answer the town would believe was a finished wall standing where they said a wall couldn't stand. The laughing didn't slow her down or speed her up. She just kept showing up at sunrise with her tools. Nathan defended her once, the day a tractor dealer named Roy asked him point-blank whether his cousin had lost her mind. Nathan looked at Roy and said Margaret knew more about steel than anyone around, then turned and walked out. He didn't see the point in arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind. After that, he stopped explaining and just showed up every morning with his tools, because the town could talk and Margaret could build, and he figured the building would settle the argument. The engineer's stamps came back in the 4th week, and Pratt signed the permits with a face like he'd eaten something sour. Margaret tacked the paperwork inside the silo door where it would stay dry, and she and Nathan broke ground on the interior the next morning. Nobody at the feed store knew the permits had cleared. Dale kept telling the tin can story to anyone who'd listen, so by the time the town found out Margaret was serious, she was already 2 weeks into the hardest part. The inside of the silo smelled like 30 years of grain dust and still air, and the first job was getting it out. Margaret and Nathan shoveled the residue off the concrete ring and swept the walls down, wearing masks because the dust hung in the closed air long after the sweeping stopped. Light came only through the open door and a single vent near the dome. The cylinder held the cold the way a well holds water. Margaret ran a grinder over the rusted patches until bright steel showed underneath, then treated the metal so the galvanizing would keep doing its job. The steel rang under the grinder, and the sound traveled up the curved walls and came back changed, like a bell heard underwater. Nathan worked the far side with a wire brush and a can of cold galvanizing paint. They moved around the circle toward each other until the whole interior shone pale and clean. The foundation came next, and they dug a trench around the existing concrete ring and poured a fresh footing wider than the old one. Margaret wanted anchor bolts set into the cure so the shell could be tied down to the concrete, because a round structure is only as windproof as its grip on the ground. Nathan ran the mixer and Margaret ran the screed. By the end of the second day, the silo sat on a ring of concrete it couldn't lift off of, no matter how hard the wind pulled. Framing the interior took the rest of the month, and Margaret used reclaimed lumber she'd been collecting for years. She set 2x6 studs from a farmhouse demolition across the county on close centers against the curved steel, cutting each top end at an angle to follow the cylinder. The boards were straight and dry and full of old nail holes she didn't bother to hide. She fastened them with traditional joinery wherever a wooden dowel would do the work a nail couldn't. Samuel had taught her that a dowel swells with the seasons and holds tighter, while a nail just sits there and rusts. She used dowels in the load joints the way he'd shown her when she was 16, drilling the peg holes by hand and tapping the oak pegs in with a mallet. The framing climbed the inside of the cylinder in a slow spiral that followed the curve. Against the steel, it looked less like a house frame and more like the ribs of something that had always been alive. The insulation went in behind the framing, 2 inches of closed-cell foam sprayed directly against the steel to seal every seam and stop condensation. She packed blown-in fill behind the foam to hold the heat, and when the foam set, the silo walls went from ringing like a drum to dead quiet. Margaret stood inside after the last batch cured and listened to the silence, then told Nathan the building had just stopped talking to the weather. He nodded because he could feel the difference, and the cylinder had crossed a line that day from a cold, echoing shell to a closed and quiet room. The floors were the part that made the silo a house instead of a shed. Margaret laid out a main floor at ground level and a second floor halfway up the cylinder, with the dome left open above as a loft where the roof let in the most light. Nathan cut the floor joists to length and hung them on joist hangers drilled into the peaks of the corrugations. That was the way the old grain bin builders intended it, back when they designed the steel with those ridges. Every fastener landed on a ridge where the metal was doubled over and thick, so the walls carried the new weight the way they'd carried the grain. Margaret checked each hanger with a level and a tap of her hammer, and nothing moved that wasn't supposed to. The 2 floors stacked inside the cylinder like the rings of a tree, and the interior began to read as a building with a purpose rather than a bin with ideas above its station. The staircase spiraled up the inside of the cylinder, built from a single fallen oak she'd milled herself 2 summers earlier. Nathan fitted the treads to the curve, and Margaret pegged each riser with dowels, and the whole stack climbed the wall without a single nail in the load path. The wood was pale and heavy, and against the steel it looked like something that had always belonged there. Up in the dome loft, she cut a skylight into the roof and reinforced the edges with steel angle so the opening never weakened the dome. The sky came down into the silo for the first time in 30 years, and Margaret stood under it on the bare loft frame and watched a hawk cross the square of blue. Nathan found her there at dusk and said the light up top was the best light on the whole property, and she agreed with him. The off-grid systems went in through the fall. A south-facing rack of solar panels stood on the ground where the sun cleared the tree line, angled to catch the winter light when it mattered most. Rainwater ran off the curved dome into a gutter she'd fashioned from salvaged sheet metal. From there, it dropped into a pair of tanks beside the foundation, through a filtration setup she'd built from sand and charcoal and ceramic. The silo had begun to drink the sky instead of just shedding it. A wood stove sat at the center of the main floor, and the concrete she'd poured around it was thick enough to hold heat all night from a single evening fire. Outside, she turned the soil where the old Bowers garden had been and started a compost pile, and by October, the first greens were up. The silo had gone from a rusted nail in the ground to a place that fed itself. The only bill she'd paid for any of it was the $1,100 at the tax sale. The storm hit in the third week of October, before the last of the trim was hung, and it came in fast off the prairie the way the bad ones do. The scaffolding Nathan had rigged inside the dome tore loose when a gust funneled through the open skylight, and a section of it swung down and nearly took him off the upper frame. He caught the railing and held on, while Margaret killed the wind through the opening by resting a panel across it, and the steel flexed around her as she worked. The silo groaned once, deep and low, and then it held. Nathan climbed down, shaking, and Margaret stood with her palm against the wall until she could feel it settle. She didn't say much about it that night, but she filed away what the steel had just told her. The cylinder would give before it would break, and it would come back to true when the load passed. She didn't know yet how much that lesson was going to matter, but the steel did. Margaret moved in before Thanksgiving, with the stove lit and the floors still curing. The first real cold came the first week of December, a hard freeze that snapped the fences and drove the cattle against the windbreaks. The town expected the tin can story to end here, with Margaret freezing inside a metal tube, while Dale Harper collected apologies at the feed store. Instead, the silo held the cold off the way a thermos holds it off, because the foam and the fill and the concrete together made a wall that the weather couldn't find a way through. The wood stove burned in the evening, and the concrete floor soaked up the heat and gave it back through the night, so the inside stayed warm long after the fire burned down to coals. Margaret banked the stove at 10 and woke at 6 to a floor that was still warm under her bare feet. She tracked the temperature through December with a thermometer Nathan had left behind, and the lowest she recorded was in the high 50s on the coldest morning with no fire lit at all. That was warm enough to sleep in, and warmer than a lot of houses that night with their furnaces running full out. She had no power bill because the solar rack covered what she needed. She had no water bill because the tanks caught every rain that fell on the roof. The only thing she bought from town was propane for a backup heater she never had to switch on. The can sat by the door all winter, with the seal still unbroken, and every time Nathan noticed it, he shook his head and said she'd built the cold right out of the place. Margaret told him the cold hadn't been built out so much as turned away. The walls were round, and the cold was just another kind of wind looking for a flat surface to lean on. Nathan came out on the coldest week and stood inside the door with his hat still on, surprised at how warm it was and how quiet. "The steel muffles the wind," he said, and Margaret agreed. They drank coffee at the table while the storm threw itself against the dome, and the walls hummed a low note that you felt more than heard. Nathan looked around at the finished loft and the stove and the light coming down through the skylight and said it didn't feel like a grain bin anymore. Margaret smiled and said it never did to her. The town started to notice that she was still there because the smoke rose out of the dome every cold morning, and the lights stayed on every night when the grid flickered. A neighbor named Walt, who'd kept quiet through the whole laughing season, stopped by in January to ask how the solar setup worked and whether his own roof could carry a few panels. Margaret showed him the rack and the charge controller and told him what it cost, and he went home thinking about it. Dale heard about the visit and made another joke, but the joke didn't land the way it used to. The men at the feed store had started driving past the Bowers place and seen the smoke rising out of the dome in the cold. A smoking tin can was harder to laugh at than a cold one. A couple of them had begun to wonder out loud whether Margaret knew something they didn't. Dale waved them off, but even he drove past the silo a little slower after that, and he didn't quite know why. Spring came early and wrong that year. The warm days pushed up into March and pulled the moisture north, and the weathermen started using a word they didn't use often in that part of the country, which was tornado. Margaret had designed for wind from the first sketch she'd drawn, because you don't build on the prairie without building for the wind that made the prairie. The curved walls were meant to turn the air around the cylinder instead of catching it flat, and the dome was meant to shed whatever hit it. The anchored footing was meant to keep the shell on the ground when the ground tried to leave. She'd built the one shape on the property that the wind couldn't get a hand on, and she'd spent a year making sure it stayed that way. Now the season was turning toward the one test she'd hoped would never come and had built for anyway. Samuel had taught her that you don't wait for the storm to decide whether your walls are strong enough. She spent the first warm week getting ready. She secured the solar rack with ground anchors and strapped the panels down. She filled the rainwater tanks to the top and checked the filtration, because the town water was about to become the least reliable thing around if the weather kept turning. She walked the door and window frames and tested the reinforcing she'd bolted around every opening, pressing against the steel to make sure nothing had loosened over the winter. Nathan came out and helped her brace the skylight and clear the loose gear off the dome. When they finished, the silo sat low and heavy and ready, the way a ship sits before a sea. He looked at the sky to the west and said he didn't like the look of it. Margaret told him she didn't either, and that was all they said about it, because there wasn't anything else to say. The town didn't take the warnings seriously at first, because the sirens had cried wolf more years than not, and Dale told the feed store that Margaret was battening down her bunker. The men chuckled and went back to their coffee, and then the sky changed. It went the color of old copper in the middle of the afternoon, and the air got heavy and still and wrong. The birds stopped singing all at once, the way they do when something is coming that they can feel before you can. The pressure dropped until your ears popped standing in the yard, and the sirens went up for real and stayed up. The dogs in town went quiet and then started howling, and the cattle broke their fences and walked east in lines, because the animals knew what was coming, and the people were still pouring coffee. Margaret was already inside. She'd watched the sky go copper from the loft, and she'd come down and closed the reinforced door and latched it. She lit the stove for warmth and for light, because the solar was about to become useless. Then she sat on the floor near the center of the cylinder with her back against the stair post. She couldn't reach Nathan because the cell towers were already failing, and she was alone in the steel, about to be tested by exactly the kind of wind she'd built it to survive. The sound comes first. It comes low and steady, like a freight train idling on the next ridge over. And then it builds until the air itself is the sound, and there's no silence left anywhere. Margaret sits on the floor with her hands flat on the concrete and her eyes closed, and the silo begins to sing. The steel vibrates at a pitch she's never heard it reach, a tight, high whine under the deep roar, and the walls flex in tiny measures she can feel through the floor. The dome takes the first real load of its life, and the wind runs over it and around it the way water runs over a stone in a creek. It finds no flat surface to push against and no edge to catch. Debris hammers the steel from every direction at once, branches and sheet metal and loose tin that would have punched through a roof, and most of it glances off the curved walls and keeps going. The sound inside is something past loud, a pressure against the chest that makes breathing a thing you have to remember to do. Outside, the town comes apart. Houses lose their roofs in single pieces that cartwheel across the fields, and the walls that held the roofs fold outward like cards leaned against each other. Barns roll off their foundations and scatter their lumber in lines across the pasture. The grain trucks at the co-op slide across the lot and stack against the elevator like toys swept into a corner. Every building the feed store crowd had ever laughed about is coming off the ground right now, and the one they'd laughed at the most is the one holding still. Inside the silo, Margaret holds on. The wind hits the cylinder and splits around it, because that's what a round wall does to moving air. The force that would have flattened a flat wall runs around the curve, meets itself on the other side, and cancels out. The dome sheds the debris that comes at it. The anchor bolts hold the shell to the footing, and the footing holds the ground, because the ground is the one thing the tornado can't move. She feels the cylinder give the way it gave in the October storm, a small, forgiving flex, and then she feels it come back to true when the worst of the gust rolls past. For one long second, the whole silo leans into the wind, and she's certain it's going, and then the steel catches and straightens, and the dome is still above her. She opens her eyes and looks up at the skylight, cracked but holding, and the sky through the crack is the color of a wound. The roar goes on for what feels like an hour, and is probably 4 minutes. Then it begins to thin, and the sound drops a register at a time. The steel settles back against its bolts with a long, low groan that fades into the quiet. Margaret opens her eyes to find the stove still lit, and the door still latched, and the walls still standing around her in a perfect circle. She sits for a long time before she moves, because her hands are shaking, and she wants them steady before she touches the latch, and the quiet outside is the heaviest quiet she's ever heard. It's the kind of quiet that comes after something has finished taking everything it came for. She knows, sitting there in the dark with the stove ticking, that whatever is on the other side of that door will change the meaning of every choice she made. It will change what the whole last year meant. Margaret waited for daylight before she opened the door, because she didn't trust what she'd find in the dark, and she didn't want to step into a hole she couldn't see. When the first gray light came through the skylight, she unlatched the door and pushed it open, and stood in the frame with her hand on the reinforced steel. The prairie in front of her was unrecognizable, because the Bowers fence was gone entirely, not broken, but absent, as if it had been erased from the prairie. The trees along the county road were stripped to pale trunks leaning the same direction. The road itself was buried under a drift of straw and siding and insulation that the wind had carried from somewhere she couldn't see. To the east, where the town sat 3 miles away, there was nothing standing taller than a shed, and the co-op elevator was the only structure still holding its full height against the sky. Smoke rose from 2 or 3 places where gas lines had caught, thin and straight in the still air, and the morning was very quiet and very bright. The power was out across the whole horizon, and she knew it would stay out for days because she'd watched the lines come down, and she knew what that took to fix. She turned and looked at the silo. The dome had a long scratch across it where something heavy had dragged over the steel, and one panel on the windward side was dented inward a few inches. The structure was sound. The skylight was cracked but held in its frame, and the door opened and closed on its hinges the way it had before. The solar rack was torn loose from its anchors and thrown 20 feet, but when she walked over to it, she found the panels intact under a layer of straw, scratched but unbroken. She carried them back one at a time, reconnected the rack to a spare set of anchors, and by noon she had light inside the silo again. The rainwater tanks had taken a hit but held, and the filtration still worked when she ran a test amount through it. The wood stove was fine, with the concrete floor holding its heat through the night even with no fire. She was the only person she could see in any direction who had power and clean water and a roof over her head. And the roof over her head was the one the whole county had spent a year laughing at. She filled a jug from the tank and set it by the door, because she understood before anyone arrived that the silo wasn't just her house anymore. Something had changed while she sat on that floor, and it had less to do with the wind than with what the wind had left standing. The first person to reach the silo was Walt, on foot, with his wife and a blanket around his shoulders. He'd walked 3 miles from what was left of his place. When he saw the silo standing whole against the sky, he stopped in the road and stared at it for a long time before he came the rest of the way. Margaret met him at the door and handed him the water jug without a word, and he drank and his wife drank, and then he said he didn't know how to thank her. She told him there was no need to thank her and to come in out of the sun, because the sun was the next problem after the wind. She said it the way she said most things, plain and without ceremony, and Walt understood that she wasn't being humble, she was being practical. There was work to do, and thanking her wasn't the work. They came in trickles through the afternoon, and then in a slow, steady line. There were families who'd lost their roofs, and men who'd lost their barns, and an older couple who'd been in their cellar and come up to find their house on top of the cellar door. Margaret put them to work the way Samuel would have, because idle hands in a crisis turned to panic faster than anything. She had them carry the salvageable lumber inside, fill the stove, and run water from the tanks to anyone who needed it. The solar rack charged phones and a portable radio, and by evening the silo was the only lit building for miles, and the only one with water that didn't have to be boiled. People sat on the floor and on the stairs and in the loft, and the cylinder held them all the way it had once held grain, close and even and warm around the edges. A child slept in the loft under the cracked skylight, and the light from the stove reached up the curved walls and made the steel look almost soft. Dale Harper came on the second day and walked up to the door and stood there with his hat in his hands and nothing coming out of his mouth. It was the first time in anyone's memory that Dale Harper had nothing to say, and Margaret looked at him and waited. He finally told her he'd called her house a tin can, and he wanted her to know he'd been wrong about that. She didn't gloat, and she didn't lecture. She handed him a cup of coffee and told him she'd need help patching the dented panel if he had the time. Dale nodded and picked up a wrench, and that was the end of the joke that had run the whole year at the feed store. He worked on the panel for 2 hours without speaking, and when he finished, he stood back and said the steel had held up pretty well for a tin can. Margaret laughed, and Dale did too, and the laugh was different from the ones at the feed store, because this one had the storm behind it. For 4 days, the silo was the town's shelter, its water station, and its power plant, while the roads cleared and the grid came back, one broken line at a time. Margaret ran it the way she ran everything, quietly and without making a speech about it. People slept in the loft and on the main floor, and the stove never went out because someone was always there to feed it. When the power finally flickered back on across the county, the silo was the last building to need it, because it had never needed it in the first place. The town drove past it on the way home and saw the dome still sitting where it had always sat, and a lot of them drove past it more slowly than they used to. A few of them lifted a hand off the wheel as they passed, the way you do to a neighbor you've decided to respect, and Margaret saw it from the garden and let it be. When the cleanup settled and the county started to rebuild, a few of the men came back to the silo to ask Margaret how it had stayed standing. She didn't give them a lecture. She walked them around the outside and put their hands on the steel, the way Samuel had put her hand on it a long time ago. She showed them the curve that turned the wind around the cylinder instead of letting it catch a flat wall, and the dome that shed whatever hit it. She showed them the continuous skin with no seam for the wind to pry open. She showed them the anchor bolts in the footing and the reinforcing around the door, and she let them feel the weight of the base that the tornado couldn't lift. Then she told them the thing she'd learned from her grandfather, the thing the whole year had been about to prove for her. The structure had already done the hard part decades ago, when it held grain through 30 winters. All she'd done was see what was already there and use it instead of deciding it was scrap. Most people looked at the silo and saw a rusted nail in the ground, and she'd looked at it and seen a wall that already knew how to carry a load and turn a wind. The difference wasn't in the steel, she told them. The difference was in who bothered to look. She said it with her hand on the wall the way Samuel would have said it, and the men standing around her went quiet. They understood she wasn't bragging. She was handing them something to carry home. Not everyone in the county changed their mind, and Margaret didn't expect them to. But a few did, and a few is where these things start. Walt built his new shed round after talking to her, with an anchored base and a domed roof. He told the men at the feed store it cost him less than the square box he'd lost. Another farmer put a rainwater tank beside his barn and a solar rack on the south wall. He stopped complaining about the power bill the way a man stops complaining about a thing he's fixed. The county didn't rebuild itself into a row of silos, but it rebuilt a little rounder and a little lower and a little more tied to the ground than it had been. The men who drove past the Bowers place started tipping a finger off the steering wheel the way you do when you've decided to respect something. A couple of them stopped to ask Margaret what kind of anchor bolts she'd used. She stayed in the silo through the summer and the fall after, and the smoke rose out of the dome on the cold mornings the way it had before the tornado. The dented panels stayed dented, because she liked the mark it left and what it meant. Dale Harper came out once a month to drink coffee and check the bolts, and he never called it a tin can again. The silo stood where it had always stood, low and round and quiet on the prairie, doing exactly what it had been built to do, a long time before anyone thought to live in it. The silo stands against the evening sky, the dome catching the last light, the garden green where a fence used to be. Across the field, a new frame goes up where Walt's house stood, and this time the walls are round. The question was never whether Margaret was right, but what the rest of us will build next.